Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the SRAE TTA virtual topical training, the science of hope and its application to SRAE programs. My name is Julie Marchbanks from Public Strategies, and I will be your host for this session. Now at this time, I would like to introduce our moderator for this session, Jerry Regier, Director of Adolescent Pregnancy Services with Public Strategies.
Thank you, Julie, and welcome everyone to the second day of our topical training. Yesterday we had a great day, and I'm kind of pinch hitting here a little bit for Kendi, who is listed on your agenda. Kendi couldn't join us today, but she will be back and with us tomorrow. So let me just take a minute to kind of summarize what we did yesterday, and I hope all of you are looking forward to today. Yesterday we had some opening remarks which really gave us some framework. We had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Chan Hellman, who you'll hear from here in just a minute again, and he will probably summarize just a little bit of what he did yesterday, but it was just very encouraging and inspiring as people were engaged in the chat, and he told some very personal stories, and it was just very applicable, I believe, to you as a SRAE grantee and how you can incorporate some of these principles on hope into your program. And then we had an opportunity, what we're calling field talk, and these are breakout rooms. And so I hope all of you were able to participate yesterday. I know there were some drop off, but let me encourage you to be a part of that, because the report out from that time was very energetic, as people had great conversations talking about Dr. Hellman's presentation, and also some real good sharing of ideas of how to implement and put into action some of the things that we heard. So let me encourage you to be sure and stay with us for that second session today, which is the field talk session. And there will be about 10 or 11 people in your group. And it's just a great opportunity. So please join for that as well. Up yesterday with the grantee panel, and we'll do the same later today. And this is an opportunity for several grantees to specifically talk about how they've incorporated some of the principles that Dr. Hellman is talking about into their grant programs. So we'll look forward to that today as well. With that, let me encourage you again to put comments into the chat, and Dr. Hellman will give you opportunities for doing that. And then towards the end of his time, we'll have a good time for question and answer. And again, using the chat time for your questions and interaction with Dr. Hellman. Dr. Hellman, as we said yesterday, is from the University of Oklahoma, and he's focused his work on sharing the science and the ability to overcome trauma and thrive. He runs the Hope Research Center at the University of Oklahoma, and we welcome him back. Dr. Hellman.
Well, thank you, Jerry, and let me thank all the participants who are with us. I really appreciated yesterday the level of engagement in the chat function. That was really energizing for me personally, so I do appreciate that. Today, I'm going to transition and really connect hope into the deeper work that we do at the Hope Research Center, which is a focus on trauma and adversity and how it potentially robs us of hope. And then a little bit of information about how to nurture and restore that that hope. So again, I do appreciate the engagement in the chat function, and we'll have plenty of time for some Q&A. So I encourage you to be thinking about questions that you have for today, perhaps as well that maybe cropped up for you from yesterday's conversation. So with that, I'll share my screen and we'll get going. So today I'm going to really contextualize the work that we've been doing here at the Hope Research Center, primarily in the areas of trauma and adversity. Most of this work incorporates the adverse childhood experiences. I'm not going to go very deep into the ACE studies, the original ACE studies, as well as the subsequent robust body of research that is available for this area of work. My assumption is that many of you are at least somewhat familiar with this in context, but I would also highly encourage you to go to the Center for Disease Control's website dedicated to the adverse childhood experience. There's also a wonderful documentary, Resilience, the Biology of Stress and the Science of Hope, which just does an amazing job documentary in about 60 minutes of this issue. And then also Nadine Burke-Harris has a wonderful 15-minute TED Talk that goes into a little bit more about the physiology of the impact of these childhood experiences. As many of you know, the adverse childhood experiences is based upon these 10 categories of adversity that may have occurred before the age of 18. When we examine the adverse childhood experiences, it is basically a yes or no type of scoring system. So for instance, if I have experienced physical abuse, I would give myself a score of a 1. If I have not, then it's a score of a 0. Do that for each of the categories, each of these 10 categories, and then create a total score, which it ranges from 0 to 10. Historically, this is used more from a public health perspective rather than an individual scoring framework, but it is a very simple and very effective way to introduce the idea of adversity and its impact on our lives long term. So there are over 40 known outcomes associated with these adverse childhood experiences. And so I've just included a few of these associations. For instance, for individuals who have an ACE score of 4 or higher, you can see the prevalence of these difficult outcomes or these engagement in risk behaviors. I especially highlighted that an ACE score of 4 or higher results in a 600% more higher likelihood of engaging in sexual behaviors before the age of 18. This morning, I actually reviewed a couple of articles that have examined the association between adverse childhood experiences and sexual risk, not just in terms of teenage sex, but risk for sexually transmitted disease, etc. So there is a pretty clear connection between this experience of childhood adversity. One of the other things that we know about the adverse childhood experience is that, for instance, an ACE score of 6 or higher suggests that your life expectancy will be 20 years less than an individual with an ACE score of 0. So again, we know that these long-term consequences of these adverse childhood experiences, significant impact on physical health, psychological health, as well as social health. But to put it into a little bit of context, that the connection between these adverse childhood experiences and these long-term health outcomes are actually connected through this increase in risk behaviors: smoking, substance use and abuse, sexual behaviors, etc. The ACEs work suggests that some of these risk behaviors are short-term self-medication types of behaviors to the anxieties that are associated with these ACEs. And so just to kind of contextualize that work. Now, for me personally, and this idea of how does adverse childhood experiences, or how does trauma and adversity rob us of hope, what I've been focused on is really looking at how these childhood exposures to adversity influence the way in which we connect with others, the way in which we're able to relate to others. So most of our work is centered around the idea that hope is a social gift. And so as an example, we've published research that shows that youth who have an ACE score of 1 or higher have significantly lower levels of trust in professionals. Said another way, that children and youth with an ACE score of 1 or higher have significantly lower levels of trust in you as providers. And for me, what I become very interested in is how does that influence the way in which children, youth, and families engage in program services. Now, you'll remember yesterday I made the argument that your programs are in fact pathways of hope. The difficult piece is really the willpower, the idea of getting children, youth, and families to engage in these program services. So we know that this exposure to adversities, this trauma response, really influences the way in which we connect with programs, the way in which we connect with others. So just as an example, I would like for you to just consider if I have lower levels of trust in you as I begin to engage, or you come in and introduce your program services to me. And if I have a significantly lower level of trust in others, how does that influence the way in which I communicate with you and the way in which I engage in your program services? So just a few examples of what we're finding from the adverse childhood experiences. Again, trust, the perception of danger, difficulty making change and transitions, being guarded and anxious, highly physically and emotionally reactive, difficulty calming down, etc. So all of these psychological influences from childhood adversity make it very difficult for children and youth to engage in program services. So one of the things, as I begin to transition into the idea of hope in this context, Dr. Vincent Folletti, one of the original co-authors of the original Adverse Childhood Experiences study, wrote this in regards to the book that I'm a co-author on, Hope Rising. And you can see the idea that there's a lot of potential and recognition around the science of hope as a potential really organizing framework for communities and programs to begin to respond to this adverse childhood experience. I will tell you that Oklahoma ranks #1 in the nation of children with an ACE score of 2 or higher. So we tend to be a fairly high trauma state. And again, a vast majority of my research is focused on this framework. So whenever we begin to become more aware of these childhood trauma issues, many of you have probably had some exposure to trauma-informed care in that framework. From my perspective, as I've participated in community awareness panels and presentations around the state and around the country on the adverse childhood experience, the common response that we get from the participants is, okay, I understand that these adversities have significant outcomes. What do we do about that? And from my perspective, hope is what we do about that we become very hope-centered in the work that we do, that our focus and framework is recognizing that program services are in fact pathways of hope. So how do we begin to do this work intentionally? And remember, hope is not the outcome. Hope is the process that leads to those positive outcomes, including being one of the best predictors of well-being. So I'll remind us real quickly about the definition of hope, and then I'll transition into a bit of discussion about what we're finding very specifically between the connection between adverse childhood experiences and hope. So remember that hope is a way of thinking. It is not an emotion. And we have to remember that this is important because if we recognize that hope is a mindset, that it is a way of thinking, then we recognize that it is something that can be taught. So here we see that hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that you have the power to make it so. Remember that hope is about goals, pathways, and willpower. Goals become the cornerstone of our capacity for hope. Pathways thinking represent our ability to strategize or to strategically think about how we're going to pursue and achieve our goals. And the willpower becomes the motivational part of our pursuit of those goals. So I'm going to ask you to use the chat function again. And so I asked this question at every presentation I've ever given, so hundreds of times around the country, in Europe, the UK, and the Mideast, where I've had opportunities to do this training. And so I'm just going to ask you to use the chat function and just respond. What is the opposite of hope? What is your perspective on the opposite of hope? And I'm going to invite you to just watch the chat function because it is very consistent with the responses I get all over the world. And it's predominantly the belief that it is despair. That is the most common response that we get. So thank you very much again for engaging, just like you did yesterday. Again, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. So let's talk about this process or this continuum on the loss of hope. Now, you'll have to take my word for it that I'm a nurturing professor at the University of Oklahoma. But for all of those who think that despair is the opposite of hope, you're wrong. The opposite of hope is apathy. It's apathy. So let's walk through this continuum very, very quickly. I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but first I'll just highlight the idea that apathy or hopelessness is when I examine or consider a potential goal or pathways to a goal. And my mindset is driven by the idea that no matter what I do, I'm going to fail. So why try? In this apathetic sort of response, it is a giving up on the pursuit of goals. So this is the loss of motivation. This is the opposite of hope. Now, I want to highlight why despair is still an important part of hope. And with despair, just consider your own experience where you've seen it, where you've maybe experienced it. But with despair, we have intense willpower or attention dedicated to the goal. We are still focused on that goal. It's just that our pathways are significantly blocked. And so with this idea of despair, we also experience a sense of urgency. And with this urgency, that is that whatever solution is going to come has to come right now. And so what I'd like for you to consider is this idea that when we experience despair, and if we're unable to interrupt it in some fashion, that despair can lead to desperation. And so what I'd like for you to think about is just what are some examples of where you've seen desperation? In particular, where have you seen desperation in your work? And so, and Tracy, I'm going to address depression in just a few minutes. So I'll hang on to that question, but I'll come back to it. So, but just think about this idea of desperation. And here is where we start to see potentially the dark side of hope. One of the organizations that I have worked with in the past is a CASA, a court-appointed special advocates organization. And when I asked this group where they've seen desperation, one of the responses that I heard was when parents abduct a child. And so if we begin to think about that desperate act in the context of hope, we can break it down into the idea of, okay, what is the goal? The goal is to reunify with the child. Is there willpower and motivation towards that goal? Yes, and both of those are good. The problem is that when we begin to experience significant blocks to our pathways, then these desperate acts tend to lead us towards potentially dysfunctional pathways. So from my perspective, this is where the important work is around hope, is in apathy and despair. And I'll show you towards the end of the presentation some evidence of how we've been able to move the needle using hope-centered practices for children and youth experiencing despair. So I'll just go on up to the next box, which is anger. So just think in your own experience, whenever you're pursuing a goal and you experience a barrier, it is very natural for us to experience anger, frustration, anxiety, perhaps even rage as an emotional response. If we're unable to overcome that barrier, then we transition down to despair and ultimately to this idea of apathy. Now, what I do want to also highlight is that I've mentioned that hope is a mindset, that hope is a way of thinking, but emotion is an outcome of hope. So as we begin to experience success towards our goals, we begin to experience joy, happiness, etc. But when our goals are significantly blocked, then we begin to experience these negative emotions, these negative affect. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how trauma and adversity rob us of hope. And I'm going to specifically focus on goals, pathways, and willpower. And so yesterday I made the comment that when we're in the presence of distress, when we're experiencing adversity, we tend to gravitate towards an avoidant goal. But when we're able to nurture and restore that hope, we can transition to an achievement mindset. We used the example yesterday of driving the stick shift car. And our initial goal as we let the clutch out for the very first time was to not hit the BMW, which was an avoidant goal. But what our research shows is that children and families with an A score of 1 or higher are significantly more likely to be focused on avoidant goals. So they're much more likely to be focused on those goals or outcomes that they do not want to occur, as opposed to that achievement mindset. Now, the other thing that we've learned is the idea that when we're experiencing this adversity, or when we're in the presence of distress, we are much better at short-term goal setting than we are long-term goal setting. And so this avoidant and achievement mindset become very important starting places for us to begin to nurture and restore that hope. So remember, goals are the cornerstone of hope. And so if a youth that I'm working with has a specific goal that they're focused on, which is from an avoidant framework, that's exactly where we start, is we focus on helping them achieve that avoidant framework, as long as the goal is functional. And we can certainly talk about some of those issues as well. The other thing that we've learned is that, and this is especially true among youth and adolescents, middle school and high school age youth, is that children tend to have fairly limited control over their environments anyway. But when we throw in issues around childhood maltreatment, for instance, their ability to predict their environment is also at risk. And so what we tend to see is difficulty in problem solving. That is, these youth are more likely to experience distress and despair when they hit the barriers towards their pathways. They tend to give up their pathway pursuits at a higher rate than individuals who have not experienced that adversity. We also know that when we're able to nurture and restore that hope, that these youth become much better at identifying multiple pathways to the goals that they set. And the final piece, which is very interesting to me, so I'll spend just a moment here, but the research around willpower is first focused on this idea that willpower is a limited resource. That is, if this willpower is the mental energy that we have to focus on our goals, then this idea that we are depleting that willpower throughout the day, which reduces our capacity for self-regulation, our capacity for self-control. So just think about, in your own experience, when you go home at the end of the day and you're mentally exhausted, which we've all experienced. This is an example of that reduction in willpower, that loss of willpower. And what we find is that when willpower is reduced, we are much more likely to become impulsive. We are much more likely to have difficulty regulating our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. So just a recognition that willpower is a limited resource. The other thing that the research around willpower that for me is very interesting shows a connection, a correlation between the glucose in our system and willpower. And so, as you know, glucose for us in our bodies is sugar, of course, but it is really our source of energy. And this resource suggests that a majority of the glucose in our systems is depleted through our brains. There's a wonderful study that you can Google, and you can just Google chocolate chip radish study, and I believe it's in the Atlantic, but it is a nice piece written up by a New York Times journalist about this issue of glucose and willpower. It's just really fascinating. So for our work around hope, what this tells us is that nutrition matters. So nutrition programs, nutrition education matters with this idea of nurturing willpower. I will tell you anecdotally that when we work with foster youth, for instance, especially foster youth who are aging out of the system, they consistently tell us that they love when their counselors or their programs have access to snacks. Because for foster youth especially, they don't always have permission to gain access to those snacks. So very important framework for thinking about trauma and adversity, which predisposes us to be grounded in this idea of fear and worry about the future, and rumination on the past is depleting this willpower piece. So the question becomes, will ACEs lead to lower hope? What is the connection between these childhood experiences and our capacity for hope? So we've been examining this for several years, and I was really surprised in the beginning when every time I ran the statistical analysis between the adverse childhood experiences and hope, there was very little relationship. That is, there wasn't a very strong correlation between the two. And what that suggested was that there's probably some mediating factors, and I'll explain that more in detail. And so here's what we found. And so these are based upon papers that we've published. And so what we find is that when we have an ACE score of 1 or higher, we are significantly more likely to engage in rumination in the past. When we experience that rumination, we tend to be focused on that past event or events, and we're trying to process it so that we understand what happened, why it happened, and we're just trying to make meaning out of that experience. But as you know, that when we're stuck in the past, it makes it very difficult for us to be hopeful. That is, to have a focus on the future. So adverse childhood experiences tends to reduce our ability for a future expectation. We also know that an increase in these adverse childhood experiences lead to an increase in post-traumatic stress experiences, which promote the idea of anxiety, also leading to lower levels of hope. So this post-traumatic stress and anxiety, this fear and worry, is what reduces our capacity to think about the idea that the future can be better than today. So again, the connection between ACEs and hope is interrupted in these experiences of rumination, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. We just published this study. It actually just came out late July. But what we find is that, again, these adverse childhood experiences lead to or are highly predictive of an insecure attachment. Now, if we think about this idea of attachment, that is when throughout our childhood, we are continuously shown through behaviors and conversations that adults are trustworthy, that we can rely on others to provide a nurturing environment for us. And when this adverse childhood experiences is present, then we tend to see an insecure attachment style, which is, again, that lack of trust, difficulty developing close, meaningful relationships, and finding other adults as reliable, which also serves to lower or reduce hope. Now, I do want to take a moment and highlight this particular study because in this study, it was one of the first ones where we didn't study clients of programs. And in fact, the participants in these studies are service providers. So these are our program staff. And this is actually within the context of the child welfare system. So these are high achieving, highly educated adults, many of whom obviously also experience adverse childhood experiences. But the idea is that it influences all of our capacity to relate to each other in some fashion. So I'm going to respond to the depression piece, Tracy, that you had earlier. In the state of Washington, they incorporate the hope scale, the children's hope scale, which I'll actually talk about more tomorrow. But the children's hope scale was incorporated in the state of Washington's Healthy Youth Survey. So this is the survey that most states actually use with their youth. In Oklahoma, it's called the OPNEA. It's really the survey of risk, the experience of risk and protective factors among youth in our states. And so this data is based upon, I believe, about 10,000 8th, 10th, and 12th grade youth. And so with the Children's Hope scores, we're able to classify youth into these 4 categories of being high hope, moderately hopeful, slightly hopeful, or this low or no hope. And what we can see is that 60 to 70% of our slight hope group or low hope group, 60 to 70% of them report depression. So clearly there's a connection between hope and depression, anxiety, loneliness, as well as ultimately suicidal ideation, which is also at an elevated rate. Now, the good news for all of that is that we know that we can teach hope. We know that hope is something that we can nurture and restore, especially among youth. And it follows this process every time we use the exact same strategies. It always starts with this idea of goal setting. And we have to remember, just like from the stick shift example, the importance of recognizing that it's their goal, not our goal for them. So they have to really appreciate and desire the goal. So we begin this process of clarifying goals. Now, I will tell you that we have developed worksheets that we use with both youth and adults to go through this process. So we've created a worksheet that is a hope-centered goal-setting strategy. So let me ask you, just as an example, and I'll ask you to use the chat function, but just as an example, I am 2 years away from being eligible for full retirement benefits from the University of Oklahoma. I have no intentions of retiring, but I am eligible in 2 years. And if you were to ask me what my goals were upon retirement, one of the things that I would tell you is that my goal is to be financially secure when I retire. Now, let me ask you, and I'll just invite you to use the chat function for a few moments, but did you hear an avoidant goal or an achievement goal? So when I said that my goal is to be financially secure when I retire, what did you interpret from that? So, and I'll just invite you all to watch the chat function as well. So thank you again for continuing to engage. And so what we've learned in this process of nurturing hope is that when we ask children, adults, youth and adults, excuse me, what their goals are, they will typically respond in one or two sentences, in a very short statement of what the goals are. And what we've learned right away from all of this research is that we need to go much deeper. We need to have a deeper, richer understanding of the nature of goals because, for instance, once I state that my goal is to be financially secure, what we would typically do in our program services say, okay, let's set a treatment plan for that. Many of you heard achievement goals. Some of you heard avoidance. And so we've created this conversation guide worksheet that allows us to have a conversation to dig deeper. So we would follow that up with, for instance, introducing the idea that some goals are avoidant and describe what that means, and that some goals are achievement. And again, describe what we mean by that, and just engage in a conversation. So if you had offered that to me, then my response could be, that being financially secure is important to me because neither of my parents were secure. I've had to contribute to them over the years. It's caused a lot of stress for me and my family, and I just don't want that for my children. So you very much start to hear the avoidant language once we start to engage in this goal discussion. But I could have also just as easily said that in my travels to Europe, I have fallen in love with Germany. And my goal is to be able to spend 1 month a year in Germany, which is a little bit more achievement. Now, remember that mindset, avoidant achievement, drives the way I'm going to think about how to get there. So this is just one example of how we would use this conversation guide for goal exploration. Other questions that we tend to focus on in this worksheet include time frame. Is this a short-term goal or a long-term goal? Who is your social supports around those goals? Who's there to help you when you need assistance in pursuing these goals? We also spend time talking about potential detractors to this goal. So this might be other people. It might be resources. It could also be the environment. I could also be my own detractor in that goal. Another question that we discuss is, what is the degree of change that I'm going to experience when I achieve this goal? How is my life going to change? And then finally, who are the beneficiaries of achieving this goal? So again, we spend a significant amount of time going through this goal setting process in a very conversation way. And the reason that I am so focused on all of our procedures being conversation guides is because we know that hope is a social gift. Hope is not something that happens individually in isolation. It happens in relationships. So this is how we develop all of our curriculum. Once we understand the goal, then we can begin to think about those pathways and those pathway strategies. I will tell you that one of the techniques that we use has these benchmarks. So for instance, if I'm working with a youth and their goal is to be an NBA basketball star, then for me personally, I will actually start exactly with that they want to be an NBA basketball star. And I'll start to work backwards in the benchmarks. And I'll say, okay, in order to be an NBA basketball star, what has to happen? So I have to get drafted. In order to be drafted, what has to happen? I have to be on a team and get seen. In order to be on a team and get seen, so what I'm doing is I'm back stepping basically from the goal that they desire, that future expectation, so that they understand that these steps, these benchmarks, for instance, your programs in SRAE, become those important pathways that become a component of them seeing themselves in that future, of being able to not be encumbered by the barriers and difficulties associated with early sex behaviors. And then finally, once we identify the goal and we have the pathway, then we want to stop and say, let's create this future memory of success. Let's just imagine that, that you've achieved this goal. And what I begin to do is ask them to describe in great detail what goal achievement's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, who's going to be around, who's impacted. And all I'm doing is building that willpower piece. So again, we have a series of worksheets and curriculum. All of this is very much conversation guide that we're developing for across the lifespan, actually including early childhood education, but predominantly middle school, high school, and then adulthood. So I want to share with you an example of how we have worked with high ACE score youth. So this group of youth have an average ACE score close to 5. So out of those 10 ACE categories, they've significant higher rate of exposure. And these numbers in the table represent the prevalence within each category. So for instance, 78% of these youth have witnessed domestic violence. 45% have an incarcerated parent. You can see 39% experience mental illness in the family, and high rate of exposure in areas of abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional families. So these are youth who are experiencing a lot of anger, rage, and despair. And so we actually worked with a group of YMCA-oriented summer camps. So this is not a therapeutic intervention. We trained 17, 18, 19, and 20-year-old camp counselors in a 2-hour HOPE training session. And so basically it's a challenge by choice framework where the curriculum is grounded in these HOPE-centered activities, setting goals, finding those pathways to the goals, celebrating the journey as examples. Now, we measure HOPE in the youth, in these high trauma youth, 30 days before the experience. So quite a ways before they actually are going to experience the camp. We collect HOPE scores on the last day of camp, and then a 30-day follow-up. And so here are the results of HOPE among these high trauma youth. And so what you see in this graph is a statistically significant increase in a child's HOPE scores in 1 week, of HOPE-based intervention, of nurturing that HOPE. Now, what I want to share with you is this idea that at the pre-test, you can see the score is at 25, and that at the post-test, in that end of that 1 week, we see a 2-point increase in HOPE. Now, remember, yesterday I made the comment that if we can increase a child's HOPE score by 2 points, it will predict a letter grade change in the classroom. And you know as well as I do that with a rage-filled, angry youth, going from a D to a C can be a game changer in that child's life, in their perspective that the future is possible. And then you can see the 30-day follow-up. I will also tell you that longitudinally, what we found with this group of youth. Basically, there's about 3,000 youth in this study. But we saw significant improvements in parent-child relationships. We also saw significant improvements in adult observations of the children with regards to gratitude, self-control, curiosity, and social intelligence. Was this ability for empathy and this ability to place themselves in a social context. Yeah, so Yvonne, I see the question for that, and I'm almost finished with the slide. So let me finish, and then I'll come back and answer that in more detail. So we know how to do hope. We know how to do this process. It can start with a 20-minute introduction. I will tell you that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Union Public Schools has adopted this system-wide, and they've integrated it into their homeroom classes. So they have developed 25-minute curriculum-based activities around this table. So the idea is a 20-minute introduction to the concept of hope, goals, pathways, willpower, how it differs from wishful thinking. And then the conversation is about goals and goal setting and going through that process of identifying what that future potentially looks like. Now, then we would transition to the strategies, to the pathways of how to pursue those goals. And then the willpower work and problem solving. Now, I will tell you that I am a really big fan of creating a visual map or a visual reference. So I just want to say that one of the things that we've done with high school age youth is we actually had them we did a 20-minute introduction to the idea of hope, and then we gave a homework assignment. That is, youth went out and took 5 pictures of things that symbolizes the goals they have. They come back to class, they present each picture, talk about each picture in terms of how it symbolizes goals. The classroom has a full discussion on avoidance, achievement, stretch goals, etc. And then the youth chooses one picture and writes a 1-paragraph summary of why that picture symbolizes their goal. And then they have the next homework assignment, which is to take pictures of pathways to that goal. And they do the same thing. They identify 5 of them, talk about them, prioritize them, choose one, and then write a 1-paragraph summary about how that picture symbolizes the pathway to the goal they desire. Then the next homework assignment is willpower. They go through the same process. And at the end, they put the 3 pictures and 3 paragraphs together. And we now have a gallery of hope for each child that we can put up into the classroom or into the community center, whatever we're working on. Now, I will tell you that I was just in California. So Vicki, I appreciate that question. Do they all have to have cell phones? Because in Northern California, when I was out doing training there a couple weeks ago, one of the participants used Chromebooks. So they basically took the same process and the resources that were available to the students in their school. And absolutely, not everybody has access to these cell phones, but that's just one example. There are other ways to do this in terms of finding pictures, using art in some fashion. So just one example of creating a visual framework. So I'm going to go ahead, obviously, and stop. That was my final slide for trauma and adversity, sort of the continuum for the loss of hope, as well as the continuum for nurturing and restoring that hope. And so I know there's been quite a few comments or statements in the chat function, which again, I thank you all immensely for that, but we'll have, I think, some significant time for some Q&A now.
Thank you, Dr. Hellman. And yes, it's been great to see the interaction in the chat room. And maybe we could just bring a couple of those to the forefront. Before I do that, one of the things that you talked about was some worksheets, and I believe those are available on your website. Is that correct?
They are available. They're also available, the preliminary worksheets, not all of them, because some of those we're still developing and testing. But the ones that I referenced are on the website. They're also in the book, Hope Rising, and explained in a little more detail in the book.
Okay. Way back at the beginning of your presentation today, someone asked the question about the ACEs scores. If persons have experienced one of the 10 issues more than once, does that enter into the scoring?
Yeah, so one of the things, and this, I've actually had some conversations with Dr. Folletti around some of these issues. The adverse childhood experience is just one of the many different assessments that are available for this. It is really developed more from a public health perspective. So it's just whether or not the event occurred. It doesn't capture frequency of event. It doesn't indicate who the perpetrator is. And that has actually led to a project that I'm the lead researcher on with the Department of Justice to create a polyvictimization screening tool, which will be the extension to the ACE. So we're actually in the final phase of development for that.
Another question, Dr. Hellman, was all of the people in the training are communicating directly with kids that live in dangerous situations, and both cities and homes. And the question was, how does the quarantine with, in many times, addicted and abusive families affect these kids that are then in the classes that our participants are leading?
Yes, so this is a very important question that we've been, that others as well as us have been focused on, because we know that hope is a social gift. And so how the idea of quarantining, how the idea of living in a virtual environment is influencing that. One of the things that I want to highlight as a precursor to answering or responding, maybe saying answering is a little presumptive on my part, so I'll respond to the question. But Gallup, for instance, has historically assessed roughly 1 million middle school and high school students across the US every year. And one of the things that they find very consistently is that only about 45% of the youth across the country are hopeful. That is, a majority of them actually report lower hope. And I actually collected data from roughly 1,000 freshmen, ninth grade students across the state of Oklahoma. And we found very similar results over the last year, that on average, these youth are experiencing slight hope on average, not moderate or high, but the lower end of that hope. We see connections with depression, anxiety, and all of that. So this idea of being isolated, we have to find these creative strategies to connect. And in Oklahoma, it was one of the reasons for the creation of the community hope centers, which are to put these or to partner with these community centers so that we can ensure that children and youth are in the presence of nurturing adults at least part of the time. I will tell you that even outside of the context of the COVID virus, where we have these programs, and yet youth are going back to or stay in these communities of high stress, whether that's violence or in the community or violence in the home of some fashion. But what we find very consistently, and this is true, there's a wonderful study done in Oakland, California, that shows very similar high gang, high murder area in this neighborhood. But these connections to these community programs are extremely effective protective factors for youth. And so even though they are still in this environment, being around adults who continuously tell them that they matter and help them understand the future that is possible for them become incredibly important protective factors for these youth.
Dr. Hellman, as you know, everybody on the call is related to the SRAE program, and they lead these classes. And so as they come in contact with the youth in their community classes or classes in school, I'm kind of reframing Alexa's question. Is this whole idea of avoidant or achievement the difference between just a negative framing of the statement? In other words, I want not to be financially insecure, to a positive framing, I want to be financially secure. Is it as simple as that as they interact with youth?
Yeah, so the original theory by Rick Snyder, he actually talked about positive and negative goals. And I actually don't really like that, because not hitting the BMW is actually a good goal. And when we set avoidant goals, they may be very functional, good goals. Now, what we want to work towards in this hope begets hope world is we start exactly where that individual is. And we begin to set those pathways and steps, those incremental benchmarks we talked about yesterday, that these become important indicators that help us understand the future as possible. And we've seen time and time again in our research that when an individual starts in that avoidant framework, that as they begin to experience success in the program services, that is these pathways, they transition to achievement. They transition, and we have this wonderful ability to re-goal, but we have to go through that process where they internalize that success, that journey is due in large part to them, not to luck, not to the adults, not to other people. It's me. That's why I like the stick shift car example.
Lucy mentions that the camps, Camp Hope, she says up here, so evidently where she lives, are highly successful. Our kids talk about how much they love them all the time. So she's giving you some kudos.
I will highlight this, that in my almost 30 years of program evaluation, I have never seen such consistent and profound outcomes associated with an intervention for high trauma youth. And I do want to just a real quick little shout out that all of the proceeds to the book Hope Rising go to Camp Hope. They go to support that program. So that those kids are scholarshiped into those programs.
You also talked about this picture taking example you were referring to. Can you expand on what kind of pictures do they take when they're thinking of willpower?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it may be, I'm trying to think of some of the ones that I remember seeing. So in one, it was a group of friends. I think a picture of a family member. There was one that was that of the teacher and so, just these sources of motivation. Other things tend to be like music, maybe, or a movie that the youth really connects with in some fashion. So they're just symbols, so it kind of varies in that regard.
Another person, Vicky, says, are you familiar with the longitudinal study regarding children growing up in dysfunctional homes but having one trusted adult outside the home? I'm not saying that correctly.
I'm not familiar with that particular author or that particular study, but it's actually a very consistent finding that we have in these protective factors research around adverse childhood experiences, that it's just a very consistent finding that youth that as people transition out of youth from very difficult situations, who are successful, almost always will point back to one adult who believed in them. So a lot of it is qualitative in that regard, but it's very consistent.
You also, one other person asked, do all racial groups experience the same low degree of hope, or do some racial groups have lower hope than others?
This is a great question and has emerged for us over the last couple of years. I will tell you that the Department of Justice just finished last month a $4 million RFP for hope-centered law enforcement training. And embedded within that RFP was a mechanism for us to address this question very specifically, because the hope training has to be integrated with the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that is emerging, especially now. We know that issues around racism, historic trauma, for instance, all serve as barriers to pathways. They also potentially reduce the access that I have to resources and those pathways. But I'm really excited because that grant is going to allow us to take that conversation deeper. And one of the things that, as we were part of helping that process, I didn't think I should be the person leading that discussion, that I think this is a community discussion that needs to take place in the context of hope. So we now have the funding mechanism to answer that question. So hopefully in the next 6 months to a year, we'll have some information for you.
Dr. Hellman, there's a lot of comments that are thanking you for the strategies that you've laid out. And so I think people got a lot out of this session. We'll look forward to the interaction in the next session. There's a couple people that didn't get their questions answered, and please bring those up in the breakouts next hour, and that'll be a way for us to get them on record and see if we can find some answers and some responses. So thank you again, Dr. Hellman, and we will see you tomorrow.
Well, thank you all for your work.
We'll go ahead and take a break at this time and join us on our next session with that individual join link.